Heidi ho, good painters. Dr. Faust back once again with another Heroforge painting tutorial. I decided to take a little break from the fantasy and paint a little sci-fi, at least partially sci-fi, because we have a cyborg or robot, whatever you want to call him, Private Eye here. Looks kind of familiar, doesn't he? But yeah, that's what we are going to paint today. The figure we have here is fairly simple. The main areas we have to deal with are the suit, trench coat, and briefcase. When you're picking colors, you want to pick something that's appropriate, and while he's wearing a suit, we could paint that any color. I first initially painted it blue, but I realized it made him look a bit too formal, like a businessman, so I had to go back and paint it green, which seemed to be a little bit lower class suit and seemed to be a bit more appropriate for a private eye. As always, we are thinning our layers roughly a 1:3 paint to water ratio, so we have transparent layers of paint slowly building up. So we have a smooth transition throughout our highlights. On the suit here, we're only doing about 4 layers because there's not a great emphasis on the figure in regards to the suit. The trench coat and the briefcase are much more prominent, so about 4 layers is enough for here. The trench coat is a big portion of the figure, so we're going to take our time and really thin our layers. This is going to be more close to 1:5, 1:4 paint to water ratio, and we're going to be doing a lot more highlighting just because we have a much larger surface area to deal with. Normally, I recommend starting off with the darkest shade layer and then working your way up through the base coat and up to the highest highlights. However, on the trench coat here, we don't have a lot of deep recesses we need to shade. So instead, I put down the base coat of beige brown, and then I'm giving, where I want some extra shade, a heavy wash of camo black brown. And then once that's dry, I'm going to go over that once again with the beige brown, layering that on. So some of that shade layer from the camo black brown is still going to show through where I want it, but I don't have to do a whole bunch of layers with the beige brown in the beginning to cover up the camo black brown. So because we have such a broad, flat surface area with the trench coat, this is the reason why we want to have our paints a little bit more on the thin side. Because especially in that back area where that right leg comes out, we want a nice smooth transitions, because unlike on the suit, where the folds are much tighter and the surface area is much smaller, brushstrokes are really going to show up here. So have your paint thin, take your time, add additional layers if needed, so you have a nice smooth transition. As we start working up to the final highlights, in some areas you can use thicker paint and all those little belts and straps. I'm using a paint that's just a little bit thicker so we have more control over it and we get a nice crisp edge on that belt, for example. And then in the broader areas where we still want a little bit more highlight, that paint is a little bit thinner, once again going back to our 1:5-ish paint to water ratio. After finishing up all the highlights, I decided I still wanted a little bit more contrast, so the belts and the pockets really pop on this figure. So mix of black and sepia ink carefully applied to the recesses really helps those areas to pop out and be noticed. On to the hat, another fairly small portion of the miniature, so we don't have to have our paints as thin as we did on the trench coat. Also, I wanted the hat to look just a little bit beat up, a little bit disheveled, so I also used the paints a little bit thicker and made the contrast a little bit more extreme, so it looked like it was damaged a bit more. It doesn't come out well because of the, on camera, because of the shape of the hat. It's not a very flat surface area, but you're going to see the same thing done a bit more prominently on the briefcase next. So on to the briefcase, and I decided I wanted a really beat up briefcase because I kind of liked the story or the idea of you have this futuristic cyborg private eye in modern clothing carrying a really old looking briefcase. So I just like that, the old and the new put together. We're starting off by painting it a little bit of a red tone. I kind of wanted a deep red leather look to the briefcase, reddish brown look. And that also helped to detail what color his tie would be, for example. So it balances nice. We have a nice red tie, and then we have a slightly red briefcase. So it balances the figure. Remember, ages ago I talked about making sure you balance your colors. It makes the figures look much more visually appealing if you have, say, a little bit of red on top and a little bit of red on the bottom. It looks very balanced. To make this briefcase fairly distressed, there's a couple different methods I'm using here. First of all, I have the paint a little bit thicker so the brush strokes show up. I'm using a stippling method and being kind of rough placing down the highlights to show various, dings and dents in the briefcase. Also, we're going to be going a little bit extreme on the highlights, so to make those edges really, really torn up. So we originally started with a very dark reddish brown, and then we're eventually going to work our way all the way up to a very light dull yellow color. To add a bit of dirt and distress, going back with some thinned charred brown, just to do some spots, stippling on the briefcase and kind of just blend them in with the finger. So once again, just a little bit more distress to the briefcase, and you can really see now how the different application of paints makes the briefcase look completely different from the trench coat. On to our robot himself, and actually I had to paint this twice. I first painted it using regular gray paints. I wanted to show you how to do painting metal with regular paint. However, it didn't work in this case because the robot areas on this figure are so small. It just didn't work with the figure. Because they're so small, I needed something that was a bit more prominent, a bit more eye-catching, so I had to switch over, instead of go for a more traditional metal look. So then you can see his face really stand out between the hat and the trench coat. And then once again, we're going back to a fairly much more simple idea of painting here as opposed to what we did on the trench coat or the briefcase. We just put down the base coat, we put down a black ink because we have a lot of fine little details on our robots. There's some little engraving on the head, and then we just follow that up with a highlight. And before that, a clean up with steel if necessary, but then a highlight of chrome. So once again, 3-ish layers as opposed to the big trench coat, which took many, many more, twice as many at least. And there we go, we have our Cyborg PI, Rex Dart, I've been calling him. Fairly simple miniature. Like I said, there's only a few main areas. We don't have a lot of belts, pouches, and weapons to deal with. So main concentration is on the trench coat. Take our time with that, smooth layers. Briefcase paints a little bit thicker so the brushstrokes show up a bit more, looks more distressed, up the contrast. And then the smaller areas you can get away with just a couple highlights or even just a base coat wash and highlight because they're not as important to the eye. Remember, if you do want to work on your layering techniques, large, smooth areas like the trench coat, it's a really good area to practice on. Also, it's very difficult. If those brush strokes are still showing up, you have to have your paint thinner or you have to use more transitional layers. Either method will work. But that's it for Rex Dart, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.